with me today is Jo Salas. Jo Salas is the co-founder of Playback Theatre here on the occasion of the International Playback Theatre Network Conference happening at Christ University. Jo Salas is not only an incredible speaker but also an author, a playback practitioner, a teacher and a social activist. So here we are today with Jo Salas to gain some insight into what playback theatre is all about and what we as an audience can learn from it. So we're so happy to have you with us today.
Thank you.
And I think a good place to start would be early on in your career as a playback co-founder. Did you start out as a theatre artist, or was theatre something you came across when you started using playback to reach out to audiences?
I did not have a background in theatre. I'd always been an artist of one kind or another. I'd played music all my life. I did some visual art. I wrote, but I hadn't done theatre until Jonathan and I, when we were very young married couple, we began a small theatre company called It's All Grace, and we weren't doing playback at that point. We were doing pieces that were improvisationally developed, but then set, and we would perform them very informally. And I got involved as a musician, so I played the violin, and I would play music with these pieces that we created. And then when Jonathan had the idea of playback, just this vision of ordinary people acting out stories told by other ordinary people, and he told me about it. I was very excited by that, and we decided to develop it. And so, you know, I was involved with that idea from the beginning, but before that I didn't have a theatre background except for that little bit of work that we had done together.
That sounds interesting. So last night we caught a little bit of the playback performance that was happening at the inauguration, and that got me thinking, what are some of the struggles you face when you're teaching playback to an audience?
Well, we don't consider that we're teaching it to an audience. I mean, we teach it to people who want to learn it in workshops, but when we have an audience, it's not so much teaching them as providing a space for them to tell the stories that are important to them. So there is a little bit of very indirect teaching in the sense that there is a ritual, there's a protocol that we follow, and we need to kind of let people know what that is, but we do it very gently and indirectly. We don't say, okay, now this is the first step and this is what you do. We just say, welcome to the teller's chair, and they learn that that's where they sit to tell their story, and so on. So it's not that performances are not about teaching. They're about providing this very magical, special place where people can be listened to in a way that they're not listened to most of the time.
And to do this, you need to have some sort of trust among your own crew.
Yes.
How do you overcome these barriers of awkwardness or not trusting each other? How do you get to the point where you all can be completely vulnerable with each other?
That's a good question, and it takes time, it takes intention, it takes making mistakes, it takes a lot of generosity and kindness and listening. So when a group is developing, they need to pay attention to each other, get to know each other, and which they do through telling stories. So and even a group that's been together for a very long time, what we do when we rehearse is we tell our own stories. So our connection gets deeper and deeper, and we learn how to play together and trust each other on stage. And the other thing that we need to have is some kind of shared vision of why we're doing this, who we want to do it for, what we want to achieve by doing playback theatre. So when we have that shared vision, and when we have this kind of loving connection between each other, and when we can come together on a regular basis to connect and play, there's just a tremendous joy in doing that together. It's deeply rewarding.
It's a rewarding experience. Let's talk about some of the projects that you were involved in. You were involved in the No More Bullying project that was started in New York, where you basically used playback with children. And I guess I was kind of curious to know, how different is it to work with children? Was it more fun or educational? What was it like to work with children?
Yeah. Well, we all along, from the very beginning of Playback Theatre, we've worked with children. We've done shows for children. We've had children come to regular public performances. And typically children are very eager to tell stories. So, the book that I wrote about work that I did with children is called Do My Story, Sing My Song, because this is another project that I did with children, but when in that series of performances, every time we did a performance for kids, they would all raise their hand and say, do my story, do my story. So children really want to tell their stories, and they need to tell their stories. And even more than for adults, children often don't get listened to, or they get contradicted. No, that didn't happen. No, I never did that. You never did that. So we honor the child's story. We trust that they're telling us what's important to them, and they're very eager to be heard. So when we began doing, the No More Bullying project, in part because we already knew that playback works with children, and so schools in the United States and I think many other places were beginning to really want to address the problem of school bullying, and it's very difficult to do that effectively. So the way it happened was a school administrator who had seen playback with an adult group with a staff training, she said, could you use this with bullying? And then we worked with her for about 6 months to develop an approach, and then we began doing it with the kids. And again, they were very eager to tell their stories. And eventually, as we continued doing the project, we learnt that with older kids, sort of 12, 13 years old and up, it was even more effective to teach them to do playback theatre, and then they would perform with us for groups of their peers. So children can not only participate and gain the knowledge that they need to deal with bullying by being audience members and tellers, they can also become actors and act out stories very empathetically.
That's incredible to hear. Another group that you worked with was a group of immigrants, where you did immigrant stories in the Hudson River Playback Theatre, if I'm not wrong.
You're correct.
And I wanted to know, how did you deal with the cultural sensitivity aspect of the whole thing? Because
right, and that was an important awareness. So our group is many of us actually were not born in the United States, so we are immigrants. I was born in New Zealand, for example. However, our immigrant status is very different. We're very privileged immigrants, and we're white.
Yeah.
And the immigrants that we were working with were mostly brown people from Latin America. And so, of course, it was extremely important to respect the cultural difference between us. And we did that in various ways. First of all, we did a lot of studying of their situation. We did a lot of relationship building. I met with groups of immigrants for a year before we did any performing. So I met with community leaders. They got to know me. They got to trust us. And so we had all of that in place before we did any performing. And then when we did performing for a group, we ended up doing over 100 performances. When we first did it, we did a sort of pilot show, and we approached it with a lot of humility. We didn't know if it would work, but we had a group of immigrant they were parents of children at a preschool, and we explained what we were doing. We said, we're here to listen to your stories because we feel that these stories are important and people don't know enough about your stories. And then they were very eager to tell stories. And at the end, we said, would you be interested in doing this more? And they said yes, they would. And they wanted people beyond us to know the stories. So we ended up creating a book. And in some of the performances, we had non-immigrants in the room as well. And it was very important to them that their stories rippled out to a wider section of the community. So I think in terms of the cultural difference, it was in the end a positive thing, because they felt, I mean, in the United States, they're very isolated and they're very discriminated against. And in the current era, with our current president, there's a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment. There's a lot of fear. People are being deported. I'm sure you've read about this. It's a terrible, terrible situation. And so for them to have this opportunity to tell their stories, not only to each other as a kind of solidarity, like this happened to me, oh, that happened to me too. They're telling them to us, and we are like representatives of the majority culture, the part of the majority culture that is supportive and respectful to them. So we were like messengers, and I think that's how they saw us, that they trusted us, and they trusted us with their very, very vulnerable stories about how they came to the United States, why they came, about the mother that they can't see who's dying, about the child that they had to leave there. Heartbreaking stories. They trusted us with those stories because it was so important that people like us know what their stories are. They know that we know why they came, why they had to come, and what they need and how we can help them. So that cultural divide became part of the point of doing this. Does that make sense to you? Do you know what I mean?
Yes,
Yeah.
I completely get it. And I think you also mentioned some of this last night at the inauguration, when you said that there's a lot of cultural conflict going on right now in the world and in the United States, like you mentioned. And one thing that it led me to think was, usually they say that playback should be neutral and non-partisanship. But are there any instances where you believe that playback should be biased? Are there any such instances?
Okay, so that's another very good question. It's a kind of philosophical debate within playback. And my personal feeling, not everyone would agree with me, is that it's perfectly appropriate for us to take a principled stance in relation to an issue. So, for example, on immigration, I mean, our feeling is that the immigrants who are forced to migrate because of poverty, which the United States has been, is part of the reason for, because of political, historical reasons, our political position is that they need and deserve and have a right to be there. Many people would not agree with us, but that's okay. They don't have to come. I mean, so in that sense, I wouldn't call it bias, but we are coming from our beliefs, our values, and in many situations, yes, we do need to be neutral in the sense that we're going to honor whatever story we hear. We're going to listen to any teller who comes. We're going to treat them with respect. We're going to include them. But ultimately, we are human beings with values. And we are not going to negate our values because of a principle of neutrality. So if someone came to the teller's chair and told a story that was offensive, racist, we are not obliged to act that out as though we have no judgment about it. It's our job to be respectful to the teller, but it's also our job to make sure that no one else in the audience is thinks that we share that opinion. So you could call that biased. I would call it principled.
So, in terms of playback theatre, would you say it's more about the story itself, or is its focus on the person or persons involved in the story?
It's, I would say, very much both. So when somebody offers their story, my commitment, our commitment, is for that person to feel heard. So if you tell me a story and we play it back, I want you to feel like you've been heard. I want you to know that you've been heard. And you know that in kind of a bodily, kinesthetic way. And if we fail to do that, then we haven't quite lived up to what we hoped. But beyond that too, your story becomes part of this tapestry of stories that we're weaving together, co-creating with the audience. And that tapestry of stories holds meaning beyond you personally. It holds meaning for everyone who's heard that story. That's now their story as well. They're going to remember that story, and it will hold meaning for them. And that combination of all of the stories in a particular event, it adds up to something more than the individual parts. So there's the teller and honoring the individual teller and her story, but there's also the story and the network, this narrative reticulation of stories that Jonathan has been doing so much work about, that holds meaning, beyond the individual, and that we believe helps a group of people to come together and connect and to counteract the kind of isolation that all of us feel now in the modern world with our gadgets and our busyness and the political divisiveness. So it's a kind of way of counteracting that separation that we all experience.
We've dealt with the story aspect of playback, we've dealt with the people, but I want to digress a little and talk about music, because
Okay.
I know that you have quite an extensive background in music as well. So how does music help you narrate the story in playback theatre?
Yeah, music is very important. So music is part of, in I think every culture that I know about, music is kind of integral in special occasions like a wedding, a funeral, a graduation. We always have music because it kind of raises the event. If you imagine a wedding with no music, it's just a little bit flat. So you have music and it raises us to another place. So that's one of the roles of music. That playback is very informal, but it's not casual. There's a ritual and there's an intention and a kind of magic about it that is different from just ordinary conversation. And music very much helps to create that atmosphere of something special is happening here. That's what the music tells us. And then beyond that, music has this incredible capacity to create mood. So there's a real analog between music and emotion, which is why every movie or TV show or theatre production uses music to help us feel suspense or tenderness or sadness, So the music can really help the flow of the story. I call it sometimes the emotional current of the story. So the music can help evoke the emotion. And then thirdly, it can help shape a story. So it can help build it up to the climax, and it can help bring it to an ending. It can help introduce a new chapter in the story. So it's possible to do playback without music, but it makes a huge difference. It's very, very helpful to have good music.
The complexity and intricacy of playback, I think, is something that people who perform it, they are the people who know it best.
Yes.
And since you've been doing playback for so many years, I think it would be apt, as while we're wrapping up, to ask you, has there been any particular story that has just stuck with you for a very long time, just one of your personal favorite stories?
Oh, there are so many. I mean, I feel like I'm enormously privileged to have heard so many stories over the years. I mean, every time I hear a story, it's like another treasure that that stays is mine. You know, I've heard that story and I'll remember it. Well, somehow I'm thinking of I'm thinking of a story that was told by a little girl in a residence for emotionally disturbed children, and we did many playback shows for these children, and they were quite disturbed children, very restricted environment, and some of them were almost too disturbed to be able to take part in something like this. And there was a little girl who was sometimes, you know, close to psychotic, very disorganized in her thinking. And we were doing a show for her, and she kept wanting to tell a story, and I was reluctant to have her come to the teller's chair because I knew that she would be all over the place, you know, with her story. But eventually I said, okay, come tell your story. And she told the story, and it was just crystal clear. She came to the teller's chair and she said, this is the story of how I became an artist. And she was 9 years old, and she had a story, a child who had experienced terrible neglect in her life, and but she had a story about how she first was given art materials when she was 5 years old or 6 years old, and how she loved to make art, and how that was the most important thing for her now. And it was just a purely clear, lucid, resonant, important story. And I was so glad that we had asked her to tell it.
Right now, we come to the conclusion of our session. I can't thank Jo Salas enough for giving us her invaluable time to sit down and speak to us about playback. And as we near the end, we realize that playback is so much of so much. There's so much storytelling, there's generosity, kindness, trust. It's a community in itself, and I hope that this interview gives both the viewers some insight as well as maybe some scope for playback in the future, because we have learned quite a lot sitting here together with you today, and that's where I would like to end it.